If you are still feeding your tomatoes and cucumbers with nitrogen fertilizer in July because you think bigger green plants mean a bigger harvest, then you may already be losing the very vegetables you have worked so hard to grow. I have seen this mistake more times than I can count, and I made it myself years ago. The plants looked beautiful with thick leaves and long vines, but when harvest time came, there were fewer tomatoes than I expected, and the cucumbers seemed to slow down just when they should have been producing the most. That was the moment I realized that a healthy-looking plant is not always a productive one. July changes everything in the garden, and if you keep treating your plants the same way you did in spring, they will not reward you the way they could. This is the month when tomatoes and cucumbers stop asking for more leafy growth and begin asking for something completely different. Most people never notice that change because the plants do not speak, but they show small signs if you know where to look. The leaves stay dark green, but new flowers become fewer. Tiny fruits appear and then stop growing. Some tomatoes crack, while others stay small. Cucumbers become thick at one end and thin at the other. Many gardeners think they need even more fertilizer, so they add another handful of nitrogen, and without realizing it, they make the problem worse. Many years ago, an old neighbor watched me carrying a bag of expensive fertilizer across the yard, and he smiled without saying much. Later that evening, he showed me 3 simple things he had been using for years. None of them were expensive, and 2 of them were already in my shed. He told me that in July, the smartest gardeners stop chasing leaves and start feeding the fruit instead. I did exactly what he showed me, and I still remember walking through the garden a few weeks later because I honestly could not believe the difference. The plants were calmer but stronger. The flowers held on instead of falling. The tomatoes began filling out one after another, and the cucumber vines kept producing long after many other gardens nearby had slowed down. Today, I still use those same 3 inexpensive methods because they work quietly without making big promises. And before I explain the first one, there is one mistake almost everyone makes that can cancel all 3 of them if you do not catch it in time. The biggest mistake is not the fertilizer itself. The biggest mistake is forgetting that July is no longer the beginning of the season. Your tomatoes and cucumbers have already spent weeks building stems and leaves, and now they are trying to fill fruit almost every single day. That takes a different kind of support. I always tell people to walk through the garden slowly instead of rushing with a watering can. Look closely at the plants. If the leaves are already thick and healthy but the flowers keep dropping, or the fruit grows slowly, then adding more nitrogen is like giving extra firewood to a stove that is already hot enough. You only waste money and push the plant in the wrong direction. I learned this lesson after one summer when my tomato plants reached almost to my shoulders. Anyone passing by thought I would have the biggest harvest in the neighborhood. They were impressed by the size of the plants, but I knew something was wrong because every week I expected baskets of tomatoes, and every week I carried only a few inside the house. My cucumbers did almost the same thing. They produced strong vines with fresh green leaves, but the harvest became smaller instead of larger. I remember standing there feeling disappointed because I had done everything the seed packets and fertilizer bags recommended. That same old neighbor came over again and asked me one simple question. He said, "Why are you feeding the leaves when you want the fruit?" That question stayed with me because I realized I had never really thought about it before. From that day on, I stopped looking at the tallest plants as the best plants. I started paying attention to steady flowering healthy fruit and strong roots instead. Most people never make that change, and they repeat the same mistake every July. They think something expensive must be missing when in reality they are simply feeding at the wrong time. What surprised me even more was that the old methods cost almost nothing. They were simple enough for anyone to use, and they fit naturally into the weekly routine without making extra work. You do not need shelves full of bottles or bags to grow a heavy crop. You only need to understand what the plant is asking for during this part of the season. The first inexpensive feeding I want to share may sound too ordinary to make any difference, and that is exactly why so many gardeners ignore it. I almost ignored it myself until I saw what happened after trying it only once, and the change was difficult to forget. The first inexpensive feeding that changed the way I garden was ordinary wood ash from clean, untreated firewood. Years ago, almost every family that heated with wood saved a small bucket of ash because they knew it still had value after the fire was gone. Today, many people throw it away without realizing that a little of it can help tomatoes and cucumbers during the busiest part of summer. The old man who showed me this method never measured anything with fancy tools. He simply said that too much of a good thing can become a problem, so always use a light hand. I follow the same advice even now. I take a small handful of fine cooled ash and lightly scatter it around the soil a short distance from the stem instead of piling it against the plant. Then I water gently so the nutrients move into the soil where the roots can reach them over time. I never use ash from painted wood, treated lumber, or charcoal because that is not what belongs in a vegetable garden. Clean, natural wood is the only kind I trust. The first season I tried this, I expected nothing because it seemed far too simple. After all the advertisements for expensive fertilizers, it was hard to believe that something people once considered almost worthless could make any difference. But after a couple of weeks, I noticed something that caught my attention. The tomato plants were holding more flowers instead of dropping them. The fruit began filling out more evenly, and the cucumbers looked straighter and stronger. The plants did not suddenly become twice as tall because that was never the goal. Instead, they seemed to put more energy into the vegetables themselves. That was exactly what I wanted in July. Of course, wood ash is not magic, and it is not something I use every week. Too much can upset the balance of the soil, and that is another mistake many people make after hearing about it for the first time. I would rather use a small amount and let the plants respond naturally than try to force quick results. Gardening has taught me that patience usually beats excess. There is another simple feeding that costs even less because many people already have everything they need sitting in the kitchen. I remember laughing when I first heard about it because I honestly thought nobody could grow a better harvest with something so ordinary until I saw the results with my own eyes, and from that moment it became part of my July routine every single year. The second feeding is one that surprises almost everyone because it comes from the kitchen instead of the garden shed. It is ordinary banana peel. Years ago, I used to throw every peel into the trash without giving it another thought. Then, one afternoon, an elderly gardener asked me why I was wasting something my tomatoes would gladly use. I smiled because I thought he was joking, but he explained that after the fruit begins forming, the plants appreciate extra potassium, and instead of buying another expensive product, he had been making a simple banana peel soak for many years. I decided to try it because it cost nothing except a little time. I placed a few fresh banana peels into a bucket of water and let them sit for several days in a shaded corner of the yard. Every day, I gave the bucket a gentle stir. When the water turned darker, I diluted it with clean water before using it around the base of my tomato and cucumber plants. I never poured it over the leaves because I wanted the roots to do the work. The smell was not nearly as strong as I expected, and the whole process took very little effort. What impressed me was not some overnight miracle because gardens rarely work that way. Instead, I noticed a steady improvement. The new flowers seemed stronger and more of them stayed on the plant instead of falling away. The tomatoes began to ripen more evenly, and the cucumbers kept appearing one after another even during the hottest weeks of July. That was enough to convince me this old method deserved a permanent place in my routine. Of course, I still believe balance is important. I do not replace every feeding with banana water, and I never think one simple trick can solve every problem in the garden. Healthy soil. Regular watering and good sunlight still matter every single day. But this inexpensive feeding fits perfectly into that picture because it supports the stage when the plants are working hardest to fill fruit instead of growing more leaves. Most gardeners never even think about using something they already have in the kitchen, and that is why this little method remains almost forgotten. There is still one more feeding that I consider the most useful of the three, because it not only costs very little, but also helps the soil itself become healthier over time. When an experienced gardener showed it to me, I understood why he always said that if you take care of the soil first, The plants will often take care of themselves, and this final method tied everything together in a way I had never expected. The third feeding is the one I probably trust the most because it does not only feed the plants for a short time. It also helps feed the soil that supports them every single day. I am talking about simple compost tea. That name sounds more complicated than it really is. I simply place a shovel of finished compost into a bucket of water and let it sit for a day or two. Then I stir it well and strain the liquid if needed before watering the soil around my tomatoes and cucumbers. That is all there is to it. No expensive bottles, no complicated mixing charts, no special equipment, just good compost and clean water. The first time I tried it, I honestly expected very little because the mixture looked almost too ordinary to make any difference. But after using it through July, I noticed that the plants stayed healthier during hot weather. The leaves remained a rich green without becoming overly thick, and the fruits continued developing at a steady pace. My cucumbers seemed especially happy with it because they kept sending out fresh flowers even after several heavy harvests. That was the moment I realized the old gardeners were not trying to force their plants to grow faster. They were simply helping the soil stay alive and balanced. Healthy soil quietly does work that no expensive fertilizer can fully replace. One thing I always remember is that none of these 3 feedings will save a plant that is struggling because of poor watering. This is where many gardeners lose part of their harvest without realizing it. They spend money searching for a better fertilizer, while the real problem is that the soil becomes dry one day and soak the next. Tomatoes and cucumbers prefer steady moisture. They do not like those constant swings because the roots become stressed and the plants spend their energy trying to recover instead of filling fruit. I always water deeply rather than lightly, and I try to keep the schedule as regular as possible. A layer of mulch helps even more because it keeps moisture in the soil during the hottest part of July. Many years ago, I stopped chasing miracle products and started paying more attention to these simple habits. That decision saved money every season and gave me better harvests than I had before. Still, there is one final lesson that brought all these methods together, and once I understood it, my garden became more dependable year after year. It has nothing to do with buying another product and everything to do with changing the way you look at your plants. The lesson that changed everything for me was learning to stop chasing bigger plants and start watching for small signs that tell me what the plants actually need. Every morning in July, I spend a few quiet minutes walking through the garden before the heat arrives. I look at the new flowers. I check the young tomatoes that are beginning to fill. I gently lift a cucumber leaf and look at the color. I touch the soil instead of guessing whether it needs water. These simple habits have taught me more than any bag of fertilizer ever did. When I was younger, I believed gardening was about doing more feeding, more watering, more products, more effort. Now I know that successful gardening is often about doing the right thing at the right moment and then letting nature do the rest. That change in thinking saved me money and gave me more confidence every season. I no longer feel that I must buy every new product that promises bigger harvests, because I have seen with my own eyes that simple methods used consistently often bring better results. When friends visit my garden, they sometimes ask what brand of fertilizer I use because they see healthy tomato vines covered with fruit and cucumber plants that seem to keep producing week after week. They are usually surprised when I tell them that the most valuable things in my July routine are wood ash, from clean firewood, a simple banana peel feeding, and homemade compost tea. None of these cost very much and none of them work like magic on their own. They simply support the plants at the moment when they need different nutrients than they needed in spring. That is the part many people miss. The calendar changes, and the needs of the garden change with it. Once you understand that you stop wasting money on products that push leafy growth when the plants are trying to fill fruit. I also remind myself every year that no feeding can replace healthy soil, regular watering, fresh air, and patience. Those are still the foundation of every successful harvest. The 3 inexpensive feedings simply build on that foundation. When you combine them with careful observation and steady care, the difference becomes easier to see every week. By the end of July, I often find myself carrying baskets that are heavier than I expected, and that quiet feeling of satisfaction never gets old. There is still one final idea I always keep in mind because it reminds me why these old methods have survived for so many years, and why I believe they will continue helping gardeners long into the future. When I look back over all the years I have spent in the garden, I realize that the biggest harvests never came from the most expensive products. They came from paying attention to the plants and using simple methods at the right time. That is why every July I put the nitrogen aside and let the tomatoes and cucumbers focus on what really matters. They have already built their leaves and vines. Now they want to grow healthy fruit that tastes good and keeps producing for weeks. A little clean wood ash used carefully. A simple banana peel feeding prepared with nothing more than water and patience. A bucket of homemade compost tea that quietly feeds the soil as much as the plants. These 3 inexpensive methods have stayed with me because they are easy to repeat and they fit naturally into the rhythm of the garden. I never expect miracles because gardening has never worked that way. Instead, I expect steady progress, and that is exactly what I usually see. More flowers staying on the plants, more tomatoes filling evenly, more cucumbers ready to pick every few days. Most importantly, I enjoy walking into the garden, knowing that I am working with nature instead of trying to force it. If one season is a little hotter or a little wetter, I simply adjust my watering and keep following the same basic principles. They have served gardeners for generations because they are practical and affordable. You do not need a shelf full of expensive fertilizers to grow food your family will be proud of. You need healthy soil, careful observation, and a few trusted habits that have stood the test of time. I hope these simple ideas save you some money and help you enjoy heavier baskets this summer, because there are few feelings better than carrying home tomatoes still warm from the sun and crisp cucumbers picked only a few minutes before dinner. Every season teaches us something new if we are willing to slow down and watch. That is one of the reasons I still love gardening after all these years. And I can promise you this: there is always another old method waiting to be remembered. In the next video, I want to show you another forgotten trick that many experienced gardeners quietly use to keep vegetables healthy through the hottest weeks of summer without relying on expensive products, and I think it may surprise you just as much as it surprised me the first time I saw it work.